A garden party in the height of summer. A guest who walked into an estate's famous hedge maze and never walked out. A body found at the centre hours later, strangled. And the detail that makes it impossible, the only entrance to that maze was watched the entire time, by multiple people, and no one was seen leaving. How does a murderer walk through a solid wall of you? Hello, I'm Jack, this is Midnight Pages from Ohio, and I'm very glad you've stopped by. Today we are walking the shaded paths of Long Wychwood. Leave a comment and tell me what you think of the case as we go. Now, let's turn the page. Chapter 1: Arrivals at Long Wychwood. Miss Jane Marple arrived at the great estate of Long Wychwood on a particularly breathless, golden Tuesday afternoon, stepping carefully from the leather-scented interior of a hired motorcar into a blinding wash of high July sunlight. The train journey from her own village of St. Mary Mead had been a slow, meandering passage through the deepest, most vibrant green of the English countryside, the rhythmic clack of the iron wheels serving as a soothing prelude to what she warmly anticipated would be a quiet, uneventful fortnight. The narrow country lane approaching the estate was lined for a solid mile with ancient, gnarled oaks, their thick branches forming a cool, dappled green tunnel that suddenly opened to reveal the magnificent house. Long Wychwood was breathtaking in its sheer scale, an architectural sprawling of pale, sun-warmed stone and clinging, dark ivy that spoke eloquently of centuries of accumulated wealth, deep entrenchment in the county, and unquestioned authority. It was less a house and more a small, entirely sovereign territory. As the heavy motorcar crunched to a halt on the sweeping curve of the white gravel drive, the sheer, overwhelming scale of the manicured grounds became fully apparent. Wide, elegant stone terraces gave way to perfectly rolled lawns, which swept gracefully down past a string of decorative carp pools where bright orange flashes moved lazily in the dark water. But the eye, whether it wished to or not, was inevitably drawn to the estate's most famous feature, sitting squat, dark, and utterly motionless against the vibrant summer green of the parkland, the great hedge maze. Even from the safety of the terrace, it was an imposing, almost forbidding structure. Its walls of ancient, densely packed yew stood a formidable 8 feet high, cut with absolute, mathematical precision, forming a dark geometric block. It was a piece of living architecture, silent, deeply shadowy, and perpetually watchful. The arriving house guests were gathering for an afternoon tea on the lower terrace, forming a moving tableau of polite, murmured conversation, the gentle clinking of fine china teacups, and the soft rustle of expensive summer silks. Sir Henry Tarrant, the aging baronet to whom all this magnificent history belonged, received his various guests with a formal, highly strained courtesy. He was a very tall man, thinned considerably by age and an undefined anxiety, whose polite smile never quite reached his cold, pale eyes. He gave the distinct, uncomfortable impression of being permanently, heavily burdened by the immense weight of his own ancestry, treating the basic tenets of hospitality as a strict duty rather than a genuine pleasure. Moving smoothly among the guests with a sharp, highly efficient grace was Mr. Gerald Ashe. A prominent London solicitor of 45, Ashe personally managed the Tarrant estate's notoriously formidable legal and financial affairs. He was impeccably dressed in a light, perfectly tailored summer suit, his precise movements crisp and slightly impatient. He possessed a distinct air of faint, unshakable condescension, speaking to the assembled guests as though they were minor, irritating contractual errors he simply had not yet had the time to correct. Miss Marple, quietly sipping her hot tea from a delicate cup, noticed the calculating way his dark eyes constantly assessed the terrace, cataloguing every minor detail, tracking every subtle interaction with cold, predatory precision. She quietly filed the observation away in that precise, perfectly ordered filing cabinet of her mind. The slightly strained atmosphere was lifted considerably by the arrival of Lady Wychwood, Sir Henry's vivacious, widowed sister-in-law. Her profound, entirely genuine good nature was matched only by her endearing inability to ever finish a complete sentence. She fluttered happily from guest to guest, a whirlwind of pastel silk and genuine, bubbling warmth. "Jane, my dear," she had exclaimed upon Miss Marple's arrival, embracing her warmly, "so immensely glad you could. The train is always so terribly, but you're safely here now, and we shall definitely have such a lovely—" The other guests formed a fascinating tapestry of quiet, tightly coiled tensions. Lady Constance Fall, Sir Henry's bitter, wealthy cousin, sat rigidly upright in a high-backed wicker chair. She was a woman seemingly carved from hard, unforgiving wood, her ancient, highly public grievance against Gerald Ashe worn openly like a piece of unfashionable, heavy iron jewelry. Beside her, Colonel Maitland, a bluff, retired military officer with a ruddy, wind-burned complexion and a loud, booming voice, was expansive and overly hearty, actively overcompensating for the general atmosphere of restraint. A little apart from the rest of the group stood Mrs. Daphne Lorimer. She was composed, very still, and elegantly dressed in dark silk, but her cool eyes followed Gerald Ashe with a cold, entirely unreadable intensity. She was Ashe's recently estranged wife, and her presence was a genuine puzzle, invited, perhaps, by a careless accident of the social secretary, or perhaps by someone's very specific, highly malicious design. After tea, Miss Marple was shown up the grand staircase to her room in the East Wing, a beautiful, spacious suite offered by Lady Wychwood for the duration of her stay. It was an airy and bright room, with tall, floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the eastern perimeter of the vast gardens. The warm summer air drifting in was sweet with the scent of climbing roses. As she stood quietly unpacking her modest, sensible valise, placing her soft knitted shawls carefully in the massive mahogany wardrobe, she paused by the tall window glass. Down below on the lawns, the shadows of the great trees were lengthening quickly across the grass. On the far eastern edge of the lawn, a solitary, distinct figure was walking slowly. It was Gerald Ashe. He was pacing the outer perimeter of the great hedge maze, quite alone, his light suit stark against the dark, impenetrable yew. In his hand, he held what appeared to be a small sheaf of dense legal papers, which he consulted periodically as he walked. He would stop abruptly, look directly at the blank, impenetrable green wall, look down at his papers with a frown, and then walk on, his brow furrowed in deep, troubled concentration. The evening air was perfectly still, and the only sound reaching her window was the faint, rhythmic crunch of his expensive shoes on the dry grass. Miss Marple stood for a very long time watching him, her unpacking entirely forgotten. It was a curious, deeply unsettling image, a man of supreme, arrogant confidence actively studying the outside of something, seemingly with no idea whatsoever of what lay hidden inside it. Chapter 2: The Garden Party and Mr. Ashe. The following afternoon, the vast estate was given over entirely to a grand, sprawling garden party, an exhausting annual tradition that Sir Henry endured with barely concealed gritted teeth and which the surrounding county eagerly anticipated for months. It was a day of high, unbroken, incredibly fierce summer heat. The heavy air was absolutely still, thick with the overpowering scent of crushed, dry grass, profusely blooming heliotrope, and the sweet, sharp, highly distinct tang of fresh strawberries served from massive, sweating silver bowls. A huge, gleaming white marquee had been erected on the main, sweeping lawn, its canvas sides rolled all the way up to catch any faint, passing breeze, and the steady, polite drone of localized, highly polite conversation hung heavily over the grounds like the relentless hum of industrious, wealthy bees. Gerald Ashe moved smoothly through the assembled, sweating guests with the polished, highly professional ease of a man entirely in his own calculated element. He shook dozens of hands, murmured precisely the appropriate pleasantries about the unseasonable weather and the failing local crops, and successfully maintained a flawless, impenetrable facade of geniality. Yet Miss Marple, seated quietly in the deep, dappled shade of a truly magnificent, ancient copper beech tree with her knitting in her lap, noticed a highly distinct, almost perfectly choreographed pattern in his continuous movements. He navigated the crowded, brightly colored lawn with the strategic, ruthless precision of a master chess piece. He was always moving, always seemingly engaged in vital conversation, but he actively, meticulously ensured that a physical buffer of lesser guests, a long table of clinking refreshments, or a heavy piece of stone statuary remained firmly, securely between himself and two very specific women. Whenever Mrs. Lorimer slowly turned her cool, assessing gaze in his direction, Ashe was already swiftly turning away to speak urgently to the bewildered vicar. Whenever Lady Constance approached, her jaw set like a trap, Ashe suddenly found himself urgently required by a local, completely confused magistrate. It was a masterful, fluid display of complete social avoidance, executed with such supreme smoothness that almost no one noticed it. Almost no one. Beyond the immediate, noisy festivity of the White Marquee, the massive estate stretched out toward its absolute boundaries. At the far eastern edge, where a low, crumbling, moss-covered stone wall physically separated the immaculate, private grounds from a dusty, public country lane, a solitary, incredibly still man stood watching the party. He was poorly dressed in a heavily faded, patched jacket, his face deeply shadowed by the pulled-down brim of a worn, shapeless hat, but his posture was rigid, vibrating with an intense, burning attention. He did not lean casually against the wall, he stood perfectly straight, his rough hands gripping the hot stone as if attempting to crush it. Miss Marple observed a large groundskeeper, a burly, highly territorial man in a thick tweed cap, approach him aggressively from the estate side. The physical distance was far too great to hear the angry words exchanged, but the violent pantomime was crystal clear. The groundskeeper gestured emphatically, pointing sharply down the dusty lane, his entire posture highly aggressive and threatening. The dark man at the wall did not move immediately. He stood his ground for a long, incredibly tense moment, completely ignoring the groundskeeper, his dark gaze fixing briefly and violently on the distant, moving figure of Gerald Ashe. Then, very slowly, with a deliberate, radiating reluctance, the man, Philip Jarvis, though Miss Marple naturally did not yet know his name, turned and walked slowly away down the hot, dusty lane, his long shadow stretching out ominously behind him. A few wealthy guests nearby glanced over, murmured distastefully to each other about the rising problem of vagrants, and quickly returned to their cold champagne. The great hedge maze, naturally, was the subject of much intense admiration and nervous speculation from the visiting crowd. It sat like a dark, sleeping, ancient beast at the very edge of the bright festivities. Guests strolled in tentative pairs to its north gate, peering curiously into the cool, deep green gloom of its narrow entrance. The massive yew walls, up close, revealed slightly different, subtle shades of green, the older, deeper growth considerably darker, the newer, softer tips lighter, all woven seamlessly together into a dense, absolutely impenetrable, terrifyingly solid barrier. Very few ventured far inside. The suffocating heat of the afternoon made the claustrophobic prospect of getting genuinely lost highly unappealing. At approximately 3 o'clock, with the burning sun at its highest and most punishing point, Gerald Ashe deliberately detached himself from a boring group discussing local county politics. He wiped a single bead of sweat from his high forehead with a crisp, monogrammed linen handkerchief and made his way purposefully toward the maze. His pace was highly deliberate, his expression completely closed, locked tight. He walked entirely alone. Passing the young, visibly stressed footman, Thomas, who was sweating heavily in his thick livery and carrying a massive, heavy silver tray of empty crystal glasses back toward the main house, Ashe paused. "I am going to seek a few minutes of absolute quiet, Thomas," Ashe said, his sharp voice carrying clearly and distinctly on the still, heavy air. It wasn't a polite request, it was an absolute, unbreakable instruction. "See that I am absolutely not disturbed by anyone." "Yes, sir," Thomas replied, his tone sullen and deeply resentful, his angry eyes dropping quickly to the dry grass. Ashe turned sharply and stepped boldly through the north gate. His light-colored, expensive summer suit was almost immediately swallowed whole by the dark, encroaching, hungry hue. The gate was the absolute only entrance, a narrow, dark break in the solid green wall, watched over silently by a pair of massive, weathered stone griffins. The huge hedge seemed to close seamlessly behind him, absorbing the sharp crunch of his footsteps instantly. Miss Marple, watching intently from the deep shade of her copper beech, felt a sudden, inexplicable, bone-deep chill, despite the overwhelming heat of the day. The maze had taken him completely in, and the entire, burning afternoon seemed to suddenly hold its breath. That was the absolute last time anyone saw Gerald Ashe alive. Chapter 3: The Vanishing. The long afternoon wore slowly on, a slow, incredibly golden, lazy slide toward the cooler evening. The fierce, punishing heat of 3 o'clock mellowed significantly, and the long, sharp shadows of the great trees began to stretch dramatically across the drying lawns. The garden party gradually entered its final, most languid, exhausted phase. People continued their polite, repetitive conversations, lazily admiring the drooping herbaceous borders, politely requesting second cups of lukewarm tea, and complaining mildly about the sudden arrival of biting midges. The complete absence of Gerald Ashe was not initially noted by anyone. In a sprawling, noisy gathering of 200 people, one single man deliberately seeking quiet is incredibly easy to overlook entirely. General attention gradually attenuated as the party slowly began to wind down and cars were summoned. Near the dark, imposing north gate of the maze, a small, weary group had established themselves firmly on the cool stone benches, desperately seeking the deep, solid shade cast by the high yew walls. There was Mrs. Higgins, the highly observant vicar's wife, a woman whose sharp, darting eyes missed absolutely nothing and whose mouth rapidly repeated everything she saw, old Major Pendleton, who had fallen completely half asleep with his heavy chin resting comfortably on the silver knob of his cane, young Miss Carstairs, who was meticulously, quietly sketching the terrifying stone griffins in charcoal, and Colonel Maitland, who was loudly, enthusiastically regaling anyone who would pretend to listen with an incredibly long, detailed story about a terrifying tiger hunt in Bengal. These for very different people, in their various, entirely relaxed ways, provided an unbroken, completely continuous, if entirely unconscious, watch over the single, narrow entrance to the maze. It wasn't until past 4 o'clock, the shadows growing quite long indeed, that the first murmur of actual inquiry arose. Lady Constance, having successfully worked herself into a fresh, highly agitated state of intense indignation over a minor point of law regarding a tenant farm, loudly demanded to see Ashe immediately. She forcefully dispatched a terrified young maid to find him. The maid returned a few minutes later, panting, to say Mr. Ashe was nowhere in the main house. The inquiry spread outward, a very small ripple of minor, aristocratic annoyance. Where on earth was the man? He went into the maze, Colonel Maitland boomed loudly, gesturing wildly with a half-eaten strawberry, thoroughly interrupting his own tiger story. Saw him go in myself. Over a full hour ago, I should say. Mrs. Higgins nodded vigorously, her hat feathers bobbing. Yes, indeed he did. Walked right past us. Looked quite determined about something. And he absolutely hasn't come out, young Miss Carstairs added firmly, looking up from her smudged sketchbook. I've been drawing the gate for over an hour. Nobody has come out at all. The initial assumption was, of course, entirely, perfectly innocent. The minor annoyance shifted quickly to mild amusement, then very slowly to a faint, creeping prickle of actual worry. Perhaps he had simply fallen asleep on a stone bench somewhere deep within the twisting corridors. The heat was incredibly oppressive, after all. Or perhaps he had become mildly, embarrassingly lost, a very common enough occurrence in Long Wychwood's incredibly complex, deliberately disorienting geometry. It was a long-standing, fond joke in the county that one always needed a native guide for the Tarrant maze. Sir Henry was finally informed. He stood rigidly near the great marquee, looking profoundly, deeply irritated rather than genuinely alarmed. He intensely disliked absolutely anything that disrupted the smooth, expected running of his estate. He imperiously summoned his head groundskeeper, Miller, a stoic, deeply tanned, silent man who personally knew every single inch of the vast property. Go and fetch Mr. Ashe, Miller, Sir Henry instructed, his thin voice tight with annoyance. Tell him his presence is urgently required here. He has been hiding in there quite long enough for one day. Miller merely nodded, his leathery face entirely impassive. He walked steadily to the north gate. The four guests on the benches watched him go in with mild interest. The sound of his heavy, hobnailed boots crunching loudly on the gravel path was clearly audible for a long moment, and then the deep, absolute, deadening silence of the maze swallowed him whole, just as it had swallowed Ashe. Inside the massive structure, Miller moved rapidly and methodically. He knew the exact route. Left at the entrance. The air immediately cooled, the noise of the party outside abruptly, entirely cut off by the thick, sound-absorbing walls. He walked quickly down the long, straight passage of the long gallery, his heavy boots loud in the confined, narrow space. Empty. He returned to the junction. He took the two lefts, then the quick right, calling out Ashe's name loudly. His rough voice was strangely muffled, completely absorbed by the millions of tiny, dense needles. There was absolutely no answer. The silence inside was not peaceful, it was incredibly heavy, deeply expectant, and completely unbroken. He reached the final, sharp turn that led directly to the central circular area. The guests waiting outside resumed their tepid tea, waiting patiently for the arrogant lawyer to emerge, ready with polite, slightly barbed jokes about his poor sense of direction. 10 very long minutes passed. Then 12. They waited. Chapter 4 at the center of the maze. When Miller finally reappeared at the narrow north gate, the polite, mild jokes died instantly in the waiting guests' throats. He was entirely alone, and his rough, weathered face, usually the deep, healthy color of polished oak, was now the sickly, bloodless color of old, dry parchment. He stumbled slightly as he stepped out from between the two stone griffins, as if the ground had suddenly become unsteady. He did not speak a single word to the guests sitting frozen on the benches. He did not speak to Sir Henry, who was walking rapidly toward him with a deep frown of aristocratic annoyance. Miller walked directly, with a rigid, highly unnatural gait, straight to the local police constable, who had been lazily directing traffic at the main estate gates and had only just come up to the lower terrace for a refreshing cup of cider. "You'd best come with me right now," Miller said. His voice was perfectly flat, entirely devoid of all normal human inflection. "There's been an event." He led the startled constable back into the dark mouth of the maze. Sir Henry, his profound irritation suddenly evaporating completely into a cold, sickening dread, followed closely behind them, along with a pale Colonel Maitland. They walked the twisting route in absolute silence, the tight, green walls pressing aggressively in on them, the trapped air smelling strongly of damp earth and crushed, rotting needles. They reached the central, circular area. The body of Gerald Ashe lay face down on the pale, crunching gravel, right beside the curved stone rim of the central fountain. The cold water bubbled merrily, entirely indifferent to the horrific scene. Ashe's arms were splayed awkwardly, painfully outward, his stiff fingers curled deeply into the gravel as if he had been desperately reaching for the water, or perhaps trying to claw himself blindly forward. His crisp, expensive light suit was heavily stained with dark dirt and torn at the shoulder. The immediate cause of death was brutally, instantly apparent to anyone who looked. The young constable knelt, his face pale. Ashe had been violently strangled. The sheer, terrifying violence of the brutal act contrasted obscenely with the peaceful, highly formal, controlled setting of the enclosed garden. A long length of thin, incredibly tough garden cord, exactly the kind normally used for tying up heavy perennials in the herbaceous borders, was later found discarded deep within the tangled roots of the surrounding yew hedge, its rough fibers still retaining the tight, vicious tension of the murder. The immediate reaction was a rippling, physical shockwave of absolute disbelief. Miller stood rigidly by, breathing heavily, his large, rough hands shaking uncontrollably. Sir Henry simply stared at the terrible scene with a kind of blank, completely uncomprehending horror, his lifelong aristocratic composure entirely, permanently shattered. He looked suddenly very small and very, very old. Colonel Maitland swore softly, repeatedly, stepping quickly back as if the pale gravel itself were suddenly dangerous. The local police frantically secured the immediate scene, and within an hour, Detective Inspector Henley from the main county force arrived in his car. Henley was a man of very precise, highly ordered habits, wearing a cheap suit that was a fraction too tight across his broad shoulders, and possessing a deeply, profoundly skeptical mind. He actively did not like grand houses, he deeply distrusted wealthy families, and he absolutely hated mysteries. Henley stood silently by the bubbling fountain, looking sharply from the body to the high, impenetrable, solid green walls that formed a perfect, unbroken circle all around them. He meticulously examined the disturbed gravel, the wet fountain rim, the discarded, twisted cord. He then curtly ordered the body covered with a torp and returned quickly to the north gate. He gathered the 4 key witnesses, Mrs. Higgins, Major Pendleton, Miss Carstairs, and Colonel Maitland, and questioned them aggressively on the spot, ignoring their aristocratic protests. He was relentless and rigorous. He asked detailed questions about their exact line of sight, about any possible moments of distraction, about the remote possibility of someone small slipping past them. Each witness, deeply shaken but absolutely certain, firmly confirmed exactly what they had seen. Mr. Ashe went in. No one else whatsoever went in. No one came out. Inspector Henley stood alone in the center of the lawn, the late afternoon sun casting long, dark shadows across the grass. He looked hard at Sir Henry, at the gathered, whispering guests, and finally at the dark, silent entrance of the maze itself. His expression was one of profound, angry irritation as the impossible logic locked firmly into place in his mind. The north gate is the absolute only known exit from this entire structure, Inspector Henley announced loudly, his harsh voice carrying clearly over the hushed, terrified lawn. It was under constant, unbroken observation by no fewer than 4 highly credible witnesses from the exact moment Mr. Ashe entered until the moment the groundskeeper found him. No one entered after him. No one left. Yet the body is inside, and it is undoubtedly murder. The inspector tapped his small notebook repeatedly with his pencil, a sharp, incredibly decisive, angry sound. We are faced with a stark, entirely impossible choice, ladies and gentlemen. Either this is a locked room mystery of a most theatrical and utterly impossible kind, or someone standing here is lying to my face about that gate. Chapter 5: The Geometry of the Impossible. The very next morning, the sprawling estate felt entirely, fundamentally different. The grand white marquee was completely gone, struck down hastily at dawn, leaving only a large, pale, rectangular ghost on the vibrant green lawn. The once crowded grounds were entirely empty, and a heavy, deeply oppressive, leaden silence had descended heavily over Long Wychwood, completely replacing the former gaiety. Miss Marple, who had spent the tense breakfast hour knitting quietly in a sunny corner of the morning room, her silver needles clicking rhythmically and soothingly, actively sought out Inspector Henley. She found him pacing angrily on the stone terrace, staring gloomily and resentfully at the dark bulk of the maze. She approached him slowly, adopting the gentle, highly hesitant deference of a slightly confused, elderly lady seeking simple edification. "Inspector Henley," she began, her soft voice fluttering slightly in the morning air. "Such a truly terrible, shocking tragedy. I wonder? I have always had a very great, passionate interest in complex garden design. Would it be a terrible imposition if I asked to be shown the exact interior of the maze? Just to fully understand the layout, you see. It seems so terribly bewildering to an old woman." The inspector, perhaps thinking her entirely harmless and desperately wanting any minor distraction from his own highly frustrating, circular thoughts, reluctantly agreed. "Very well. But you must keep strictly to the center paths. We've finished our work with the center for now, but don't touch anything." Together, they walked across the heavy, dew-soaked grass to the north gate. Here is exactly where the geometry of the place must be understood. Follow closely, Jack. We enter the dark north gate. Immediately, we are forcefully forced to turn left, confronted instantly by a completely solid, 8-foot wall of incredibly dense yew. The bright sound of the estate, the singing birds, the distant tractors, is instantly, completely muffled. There is only the soft hiss of the wind moving through the millions of tiny needles and the strong, rich smell of ancient, damp earth. We proceed straight ahead down a narrow, completely sunless corridor. The light here is strange, filtered, and almost aquatic. We reach a clear T-junction. Here, we turn right. This leads directly down a very long, perfectly straight passage known traditionally as the Long Gallery. It is perfectly straight, perfectly green, and it ends abruptly in a complete, solid dead end. There is absolutely nothing here but a cold, carved stone bench, which feels deeply, unnervingly chilling even in the height of the summer heat. The light at the far end is very dim. We must retrace our steps completely back to the T-junction. This time, we turn left instead. We walk 10 precise, measured paces, and take another sharp left. We walk 5 paces, and take a final, sudden right. Suddenly, the claustrophobic green walls open out entirely. We are standing in the central area, a perfect, wide circle of pale gravel, the carved stone fountain bubbling continuously in the exact middle. This is the spot. The gravel is violently disturbed where the heavy body lay. The stark police chalk marks are a brutal, violent white against the soft grey stones. Miss Marple stood quietly by the fountain, looking slowly and carefully around the completely circular clearing. At the far northeast corner, a short, seemingly blind path led toward the east outer wall. She noted it immediately, but did not walk down it. She turned back to the inspector, and together they walked the exact route in reverse, eventually emerging back into the bright, open, almost blinding sunlight of the north gate. Inspector Henley stopped abruptly and crossed his arms aggressively, laying out the timeline with deep, analytical frustration. Even if we assume the 4 witnesses were all momentarily distracted at exactly the same time, a dropped sketchpad, a spilled cup of tea, and someone slipped out the north gate entirely unseen, the timeline remains completely impossible. Miller the groundskeeper covered the entire maze in exactly 12 minutes when he went searching. He moved methodically. He met no one whatsoever coming the other way. There simply was absolutely no time for anyone to murder Ashe, arrange the body, and successfully pass Miller undetected in these tight, narrow corridors. Miss Marple looked thoughtfully at the thick, utterly impenetrable green walls of the maze, her pale blue eyes mild but intensely, sharply focused. "No time at all to pass him," she murmured, almost to herself, her voice barely a whisper. "And absolutely no way past the 4 witnesses. It is a genuine, fascinating puzzle." She carefully adjusted her soft shawl around her shoulders. Unless, of course, they didn't use the north gate at all. The words hung heavily in the still air, unspoken but overwhelmingly present in the sudden, heavy silence between them. Chapter 6: Old Grudges, Old Gardens. After a deeply somber, intensely strained dinner that evening, eaten mostly in heavy, oppressive silence broken only by the soft clinking of silver against fine china, Lady Wychwood invited Miss Marple directly to her private drawing-room upstairs. It was a remarkably cozy, comforting room, filled entirely with faded, chintz-covered armchairs, dozens of silver-framed family photographs on every available flat surface, and the specific, highly comforting intimacy of a very long, very deep friendship. Lady Wychwood, actively seeking solace in continuous conversation, poured the dark amber sherry from a heavy crystal decanter and began to talk softly about the estate's very long history, inadvertently revealing far more than she consciously realized in her scattered, meandering, deeply emotional way. "It is all so utterly dreadful, Jane," she sighed heavily, staring blankly into the small, bright fire that had been thoughtfully lit by a maid against the evening chill. "And this garden, it has always had such a long, complicated history. The maze, you know, wasn't actually original to the house. It was planted exactly 40 years ago by Thomas Jarvis." Thomas Jarvis, she explained slowly, sipping her sherry, had been the estate's highly respected head gardener, a quiet, intensely focused man who possessed a quiet, almost magical brilliance with living plants. He had worked tirelessly at Long Wychwood his entire adult life, practically living in the greenhouses. He had personally designed the maze's incredibly complex outer hedges, painstakingly cultivating the young yew entirely from thousands of tiny cuttings, and shaping the formidable, towering walls with obsessive, daily care over decades. He had a deep, powerful, completely unspoken bond with Sir Henry, a mutual respect built over years of shared silence, until a terrible, violent quarrel exactly 12 years ago shattered it forever. "It was essentially about money, I believe," Lady Wychwood recalled softly, her smooth brow furrowing in distress. Thomas was aging rapidly, his health failing badly after a hard winter. His son, Philip, aggressively demanded wages he loudly claimed were legally owed to his sick father. Sir Henry was absolutely furious at the insolence. There was terrible, loud shouting right there on the lower terrace where everyone could hear. Philip was formally, permanently banished from the entire estate, told never to return under threat of arrest. Old Thomas died a few hard years later, quite poor and broken-hearted. It was a very sad, very ugly business. She took another sip of her sweet sherry, her hand trembling slightly. And Mr. Ashe, of course, handled it all. He always managed everything unpleasant. 16 long years he's run the complex Tarrant affairs. Leases, complicated wills, large investments. He knew exactly where every single penny was located. He was terribly, ruthlessly efficient, but, well, he naturally made powerful enemies. She lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper, leaning closer. Constance, you know. Lady Constance. She absolutely never, ever forgave him for exactly how he legally interpreted her late husband's extremely complicated will. He completely denied her the beautiful dower house she desperately wanted. She always swore he did it out of sheer, unadulterated, petty malice. The conversation eventually drifted to more mundane domestic matters, the tension slowly easing. Later, very late in the evening, Miss Marple found herself alone in the vast, echoing kitchen, quietly seeking a comforting glass of warm milk before attempting to sleep. Peggy, the youngest, most exhausted kitchen maid, was slowly clearing a massive tray of heavy silver teapots, chattering away to the deeply weary cook. Absolutely terrible business, Mrs. B, Peggy sighed deeply, rubbing her visibly aching ankle with a soot-stained hand. And me having to walk miles yesterday in the heat. When I finally laid the special garden tea out at the old stone folly, I had to go all the way round the entire east side of the massive maze. Carried that heavy tray all by myself, I did. My poor feet are absolutely killing me. Miss Marple, carefully pouring her hot milk from a small saucepan, paused deliberately. The east side, Peggy? But my dear girl, the old stone folly is far to the west. Is there a proper, paved path on the east side? Oh, there's absolutely no proper path, Peggy said carelessly, tossing a dirty polishing cloth onto the long wooden table. I just forcefully squeezed right through. There's a hidden, narrow gap in the thick hedge the old gardeners sometimes use, saves walking all the long, hot way round the north gate. You just push hard right through the dense you know. Nobody ever sees you. Very convenient, said Miss Marple mildly, her voice perfectly even. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her warm milk, her lined face entirely placid, soft, and unremarkable. She said absolutely nothing more, skillfully turning the mundane conversation to the exact quality of the local butter. The listener should definitely not register the careless remark as highly significant. It was just a tired, complaining girl talking about her aching feet. But deep in Miss Marple's sharp, calculating mind, a heavy, iron lock had just softly, decisively clicked open. Chapter 7, Miss Marple takes the left path. Late the following, heavy afternoon, with the vast house feeling increasingly oppressive in its thick, nervous quiet and the local police fully occupied with formally interviewing the terrified kitchen staff, Miss Marple approached Lady Wychwood with a very polite, seemingly innocuous request. "The light is so perfectly lovely just now, my dear," she said, gesturing toward the tall windows. "I wonder if I might perhaps walk in the maze myself?" Just for a very few moments of quiet reflection. It seems such a terrible shame to let such a beautiful, historic garden be entirely shadowed by this recent tragedy." Lady Wychwood, completely exhausted by the constant tension, agreed readily, and immediately instructed the bored young constable stationed prominently at the terrace doors to allow her passage, though he was firmly ordered to follow at a discreet, respectful distance to ensure she didn't become completely lost in the confusing corridors. Miss Marple stepped up to the dark, imposing north gate alone. The late afternoon sunlight was actively turning the dense hue a deep, bruised purple color. She entered. Left at the gate. The sharp sound of her sensible, sturdy walking shoes crunching loudly on the dry gravel path was incredibly sharp in the tightly enclosed space. The sheer closeness of the high yew walls was immediate and overpowering, pressing in aggressively on either side, smelling strongly of dark, vegetal rot and faintly damp earth. The light changed instantly from the bright, golden glare of the setting sun to a cool, greenish, almost underwater shade, filtering weakly through the incredibly dense canopy of branches overhead. She walked the complex geometry with absolute, unflinching precision. She took the right turn directly into the long gallery. She walked its entire length, feeling the air temperature drop noticeably with every step. At the very dead end, the carved stone bench sat in heavy, expectant silence, cold as ice to the touch. She turned back immediately. Back to the junction. The two lefts. The quick right. She stepped calmly into the bright central area. The carved fountain bubbled merrily, exactly as it had before. The stark yellow police tape still completely cordoned off the entire area where Gerald Ashe had died so violently, fluttering slightly and uselessly in the trapped, stale air. Then, she deliberately turned her full attention to the northeast corner. She walked purposefully down the short, seemingly blind path that led directly toward the east outer wall. It ended abruptly at the solid, completely unbroken green face of the estate boundary. She examined the thick east wall very, very slowly. She walked its short length, pausing frequently, deeply studying the complex texture of the tiny leaves, the tight, unnatural intertwining of the thick branches. She stopped deliberately at the second panel from the northeast corner. She tilted her head slightly. To the completely untrained eye, it was absolutely identical to the rest, a seamless, unbroken wall of ancient, wild growth. But in the sharply slanting, late afternoon light, the exact angle of the dense foliage here was fractionally, incredibly subtly different. It did not grow wildly outward with the exact same untamed, natural vigor. The thick branches seemed almost, tightly fitted, slightly, artificially compressed at the very edges. She reached out slowly, placing the flat heel of her hand firmly against the dense, prickly green surface, at about waist height. She took a deep breath, and she pressed. Through the heavy, stubborn resistance of the intertwined branches, she felt a distinct, incredibly solid give. The massive section of hedge was not, in fact, deeply rooted in the ground at this precise point. It was artificially mounted. It moved inward, just a tiny fraction of an inch, with a faint, horrible, metallic groan of protest. She removed her hand instantly. The thick wall looked perfectly solid, entirely unbroken once more. Her lined face revealed absolutely nothing of what she had just confirmed. She carefully smoothed her tweed skirt, turned sharply, and walked briskly back out through the twisting corridors, exactly as she had come. When she finally emerged from the dark north gate, she smiled pleasantly and warmly at the waiting, bored constable. "It is, indeed, a very remarkably beautiful structure," she said brightly. The constable looked visibly puzzled by her inappropriate cheerfulness in such a genuinely grim place. He nodded politely, shifting on his feet. The reader, however, knew exactly, precisely what she had just found hidden in the green. Chapter 8: The Footman's Watch. By that same tense evening, the official police investigation had achieved a sharp, incredibly dangerous forward momentum, and its entire crushing weight had fallen squarely upon Thomas Hume, the young, unfortunate footman. Inspector Henley had proceeded methodically by a rigorous, unyielding process of elimination, and the specific facts he had quickly uncovered were genuinely damning. 2 terrified housemaids had nervously come forward to officially report a highly violent, incredibly loud argument that very morning between Gerald Ashe and Thomas behind the closed doors of the great library. Ashe had furiously caught the young man illicitly reading highly private, sensitive correspondence left carelessly on Sir Henry's massive oak desk. The frightened maids had clearly heard Ashe shouting, viciously threatening to immediately report Thomas directly to Sir Henry and have him instantly dismissed without a character, a terrifying prospect that would permanently, irrevocably ruin the poor boy's life and his desperate, ambitious dreams of eventually studying for the bar in London. Worse, much, much worse, was the hard physical evidence. When the local police conducted a highly thorough, rough search of the cramped servants' quarters in the attic, they easily found Gerald Ashe's heavy, engraved gold pocket watch, carefully wrapped in a soiled handkerchief, hidden clumsily under Thomas's thin mattress. Thomas was roughly brought into the main drawing-room for formal questioning. He was normally a young, overly confident man, somewhat prone to using long words slightly too large for his actual education. Now, under Henley's cold stare, he was deathly pale, sweating profusely, and visibly, pathetically crumbling. "I only found it," he cried out, his voice cracking horribly, as Henley dramatically produced the gleaming gold watch. "I swear I only found it dropped carelessly near the maze entrance, just by the stone griffins, shortly after Mr. Ashe went in. I fully intended to return it to him later, in private. But then they suddenly found him dead, and I simply panicked. I knew about the terrible argument. I knew exactly how it would look to the police." The desperate explanation was utterly pathetic in its sheer inadequacy. Henley's expression was one of cold, unwavering professional skepticism. He formally, politely presented his completed theory to a deeply shocked Sir Henry shortly before a very delayed dinner. The ambitious young man had powerful motive, a desperate fear of complete social ruin, undeniable opportunity. He was working in the garden all afternoon, and he actually possessed the murdered victim's stolen property. The seemingly impossible locked room aspect, Henley theorized confidently, was merely a clever trick of timing. Thomas had simply slipped quickly in and out of the north gate while the 4 elderly witnesses were momentarily distracted by a dropped teacup or a passing bird. The heavy atmosphere at the long dinner table that night was physically suffocating. Sir Henry looked quietly, deeply relieved. The horrific scandal would be neatly contained entirely to a rogue servant, completely protecting the ancient family name from further stain. Mrs. Lorimer ate her clear soup with absolute, terrifying composure, her beautiful face an unreadable, marble mask. Lady Constance was rigidly, furiously silent. Colonel Maitland blustered his loud, absolute agreement with the clever police. Miss Marple, carefully separating a tiny fish bone on her delicate china plate, spoke clearly and softly into the heavy, judgmental silence. "I once knew a very foolish young man in my own village of St. Mary Mead," she said pleasantly, conversationally, looking at absolutely no one in particular. "He was unfortunately found with a murdered man's heavy walking umbrella. The local police were quite certain he had done the dreadful deed. It seemed so terribly obvious to them, you see. Until, of course, it eventually turned out he had simply picked it up by accident from the church vestibule where the real, terribly clever culprit had deliberately left it to be found. A perfectly ordinary, innocent act of simple tidiness that very nearly got the poor, terrified boy hanged. She looked innocently around the silent table. Nobody quite knew what to do with this bizarre little anecdote. It hung suspended in the stale air, fully understood by absolutely no one, but making everyone present profoundly, inexplicably uncomfortable. Before the sweet dessert was even served, Miss Marple politely excused herself early, citing a severe headache, and walked slowly toward her quiet room in the east wing, leaving the dark, troubled house behind her. Chapter 9: The Night Visitor. Miss Marple was certainly not a woman typically plagued by high nerves or nervous exhaustion, but she possessed a highly ordered mind that simply refused to rest when a complex puzzle remained fundamentally, logically unbalanced. That long night, she suffered from a rare bout of true insomnia. Her large, comfortable room in the east wing was deeply, oppressively quiet. The darkness outside was absolute, save for the thin, piercing slivers of bright moonlight fighting through the heavy velvet curtains. She lay awake, listening closely to the ancient, massive house slowly settling, the sharp, sudden creak of a heavy floorboard, the distant, mournful sigh of the night wind trapped in the tall chimneys. At exactly 10 minutes past 2 in the morning, she firmly decided sleep was entirely impossible. She rose, wrapped a thick, warm knitted shawl securely over her sensible dressing gown, and went quietly to the tall window. She had chosen the east wing suite very specifically for this exact view. The night was brilliantly clear and surprisingly cold for July. The sweeping lawns below were washed entirely in stark, silver moonlight, rendering everything in sharp, monochrome relief. Directly below her, the long, incredibly dark block of the great hedge maze crouched menacingly on the pale grass. Further out, catching the bright moonlight brilliantly on its angled glass roof, was the Orangery, a large, ornate conservatory situated near the eastern boundary wall, entirely out of sight from the maze's famous north gate. For a very long time, absolutely nothing moved. The silver garden was a perfectly still photograph. Then, a distinct shadow slowly detached itself from the much deeper, impenetrable darkness at the base of the high estate boundary wall. It was a man. He moved with practiced, absolute silence along the dark perimeter, keeping very low, blending seamlessly with the heavy shadows of the tall hedges. He carefully traced the precise route along the east wall of the maze until he reached a very specific, seemingly random point. The second panel from the northeast corner. He paused completely, looking sharply left and right. Then, he pressed his entire weight heavily against the solid wall of yew. The bright moonlight caught a strange, entirely impossible geometric shift. The incredibly solid section of the hedge appeared to suddenly detach and pivot smoothly inward, revolving effortlessly on some unseen, perfectly balanced central axis. The man stepped quickly, practiced through the narrow, dark gap. The heavy hedge swung silently shut immediately behind him, leaving the dark wall entirely unbroken, perfectly solid once more in the moonlight. He was now safely on the far side, outside the maze entirely, moving swiftly toward the gleaming Orangery. As he reached the heavy glass door, he paused and looked up towards the house. The faint, yellow light leaking from Miss Marple's window caught his face perfectly. He froze in absolute terror for one long, terrifying second. Then he turned sharply and ran, disappearing instantly into the heavy, protecting shadows of the distant tree line. Miss Marple did not cry out or raise the alarm. She stood in absolute, perfect stillness. She looked calmly at the small carriage clock ticking on the marble mantelpiece. It was exactly 2:07 a.m. The next morning, she deliberately did not go anywhere near Inspector Henley. Instead, she quietly sought out the oldest, most long-serving members of the household staff, and finally, Lady Wychwood herself. Her soft questions were incredibly gentle, highly indirect, but relentlessly, purposefully specific. She asked detailed questions about Philip Jarvis. She learned precisely of his late father's deep, lifelong connection to the maze's incredibly complex architecture, and she confirmed the exact, bitter details of Philip's highly public banishment. When she finally returned to her room before lunch, she was quietly, immovably resolved on her course of action. Chapter 10: The Thread. Following a very late, tense breakfast, Miss Marple formally requested Lady Wychwood's immediate presence in the small morning room. The room was warm and cozy, a small, bright fire crackling cheerfully against the crisp, unexpectedly cool autumn morning, the heavy silver tea service gleaming brightly on a low mahogany table. Miss Marple's manner was completely unhurried, almost gently apologetic, as she began to carefully lay out the single, unbroken thread of the seemingly impossible crime. "We have been looking very hard at a securely locked door, my dear," Miss Marple began gently, carefully pouring the hot tea into delicate cups, "when we absolutely should have been looking for another door entirely." She explained each tiny, carefully gathered piece to her friend, walking her slowly through the cold logic. "Jack, let us walk the listener through the dark maze one final, terrible time. You enter the north gate, the one closely watched by the 4 guests. You know the exact route, the long, dark straight, the sharp right turn to the chilling dead end of the long gallery. Back to the junction. But now, take the northeast path. You reach the thick east wall, specifically the second panel from the corner. You press the hidden stone mechanism at ground level with your foot, and push the heavy hedge. It pivots smoothly inward on a massive, hidden iron spike. You step quietly through, and you are instantly outside, standing in the open grounds near the Orangery. No one sitting on the benches at the north gate can possibly see you leave. Thomas Jarvis personally designed those outer walls, Miss Marple explained, her voice precise and unwavering. He secretly, painstakingly built a second, hidden exit. It opens only inward, completely invisible from the outside unless you know exactly, precisely where to press. He told his son, Philip, when he was just a child. No one else currently living knows it exists. She set her delicate teacup down softly. Philip Jarvis used that secret exit. He entered unseen from the lane before the garden party even began. He stepped through the secret panel, walked straight to the center fountain, and simply waited in the heat. When Mr. Ashe came in seeking absolute quiet, Philip was already there. The violent confrontation happened immediately at the fountain. Afterward, Philip simply used the exit to leave the maze. He was hiding safely in the warm Orangery when the loud alarm was finally raised. But why? Lady Wychwood asked, her pale hands trembling violently, her face deathly white. Why such a terrible thing? Miss Marple sighed, a sound of deep, profound sadness. I made discreet, urgent inquiries in London regarding Mr. Ashe's suppressed documents. Thomas Jarvis was Sir Henry's older half-brother. Born before their father's official marriage, acknowledged privately but never, ever legally. He was legally owed a highly significant, life-changing bequest. Mr. Ashe deliberately suppressed those vital documents to protect Sir Henry's vast finances and his own incredibly lucrative position as manager. 2 years ago, Philip found his late father's hidden letters and went directly to Ashe's London office. Ashe laughed at him, Lady Wychwood whispered in horror, suddenly remembering the rumors. Yes, he did. He laughed at him cruelly and showed him the door. Philip had the means, the secret exit. He had the brutal method. And he had a terrible, festering motive. A cruel laugh, Lady Wychwood, can be a very, very dangerous thing to a desperate, grieving man. Thomas Hume is entirely innocent. Lady Wychwood stared blankly at the crackling fire, tears in her eyes. What on earth should we do, Jane? Miss Marple stood up slowly, meticulously smoothing her tweed skirt. I shall go to the Orangery, she said quietly. Chapter 11, The Confession at the Orangery. The long, slow walk from the main house to the Orangery was entirely solitary. The morning air was sharp, incredibly crisp and cool, the rhythmic crunch of the white gravel exceptionally loud under Miss Marple's sensible shoes. The Orangery, a massive, ornate Victorian glass house, caught the bright autumn light, gleaming like a giant, delicate jewel box at the far, quiet edge of the great estate. She opened the heavy, brass-handled door and stepped carefully inside. The thick warmth was immediate and totally enveloping, carrying the rich, incredibly damp smell of turned earth and the sharp, startlingly clean citrus scent of long rows of carefully overwintered lemon trees. Philip Jarvis was sitting very still on a rough wooden potting bench at the far end of the long glass house. He looked up slowly as the elderly lady approached. His cheap clothes were heavily stained with dark dirt and dried sweat, his lined face drawn and profoundly, completely exhausted. He made absolutely no move to run or hide. He looked exactly like a man who had finally reached the absolute end of a very long, very bitter road. Miss Marple did not forcefully interrogate him. She sat down very carefully on a cold, wrought-iron chair directly opposite him. She spoke first about the maze. It is a truly masterful, extraordinary piece of topiary, she said quietly, looking thoughtfully at the bright yellow lemon trees. Your father was a true, dedicated artist. I know all about the east exit, Mr. Jarvis. The second panel from the northeast corner. She watched his dark face closely. There was absolutely no surprise. Only a slow, heavy, terrible resignation. He looked down at his large, dirt-stained hands. He told me the secret when I was exactly 10 years old, Philip said, his voice rough, low, and cracking. Said a clever man should always build a safe way out of his own creations. Just in case. Miss Marple nodded gently. Tell me about him. About Thomas. The long conversation that followed was an unhurried, deeply dramatic, tragic unraveling. Philip spoke of a gentle, highly skilled man who had spent 40 long years lovingly caring for a massive garden that wasn't legally his, coaxing incredible beauty from the stubborn soil, asking for very, very little in return. And at the very end, when he was old, frail, and physically broken, a simple, basic acknowledgement of his own bloodline had been cruelly, legally withheld by a solicitor's pen. He described the long, angry journey to London, the imposing, intimidating oak doors of Gerald Ashe's expensive office. He described presenting the old, fragile letters, the undeniable proof of his father's birthright. He looked at them, Philip said, his voice suddenly trembling with fresh, remembered rage. He read my grandfather's own handwriting. And then he simply sat back in his expensive leather chair, and he laughed at me. He laughed. He told me I was nothing but a dirty gardener's son with a ridiculous grievance and an overly active imagination. He told me if I ever came anywhere near the estate again, he'd have me jailed for criminal extortion. Miss Marple did not offer any harsh judgment. Her soft response was quieter, steeped in a deep, lifelong understanding of terrible human frailty and the corrosive nature of unchecked arrogance. "I am so very, very sorry, Mr. Jarvis." She stood up slowly. "Inspector Henley will naturally have to be involved now. You fully understand that?" Philip nodded slowly, deeply. He looked around the bright, beautifully warm glasshouse, as if trying to permanently memorize the golden light. He looked at a battered tin thermos sitting on the wooden bench. "May I have one more cup of tea from the thermos?" he asked softly. It was a small, intensely human, almost unbearable detail. "Before they come with the handcuffs." Miss Marple walked over to the bench, carefully unscrewed the metal thermos, and slowly poured the hot tea into the plastic cup. "I don't see why not," she said softly, handing it to him. Chapter 12. What the Maze Keeps. Philip Jarvis surrendered himself quietly and without a struggle to Inspector Henley within the hour. The long walk from the Orangery back to the main house was solemn, Philip flanked tightly by two nervous constables, Henley's red face a complex mixture of official triumph and profound, highly visible irritation that an elderly spinster from a quiet village had so easily solved his impossible locked-room mystery. Thomas Hume was officially released from police custody immediately. His reaction was not gratitude exactly, it was a bewildered, incredibly shaky relief, his former youthful arrogance entirely stripped away by genuine terror. The subsequent discovery of the secret exit caused an absolute, overwhelming sensation. The national press descended on the quiet estate like a flock of hungry crows. The scene at the east wall was utterly chaotic, with shouting photographers aggressively demanding endless demonstrations of the pivoting hedge panel. The marvel of organic engineering, a solid wall of living yew that swung magically inward, was splashed widely across all the national papers, almost completely overshadowing the brutal murder itself. The Tarrant estate retreated firmly behind locked iron gates, besieged by relentless, vulgar curiosity. Under immense public and legal pressure, Sir Henry authorized a full, independent, highly expensive review of the entire Tarrant estate records. His manner in doing so was intensely reluctant, formally correct, but he looked suddenly incredibly frail, a man visibly, tragically older than he had been just yesterday. The legal validity of Thomas Jarvis's long-buried claim was handed over to the slow, incredibly expensive machinery of London lawyers. The future of the Great Maze was left genuinely uncertain. It stood alone in the center of the vast grounds, massive, dark, and utterly silent. The north gate was heavily padlocked with thick chains. The twisting corridors were completely empty, the central fountain turned off. It kept its ancient silence, a dark, geometric monument to a gardener's incredible skill and a son's terrible, violent revenge. Miss Marple, on her final evening before returning to St. Mary Mead, stood at her tall window, looking out at the darkened, sleeping garden. She reflected quietly on the terrible sin of vanity. Gerald Ashe had been vain enough to find Philip Jarvis laughable, entirely secure in his own immense power, sharp intellect, and high social standing. He believed himself entirely untouchable by those beneath him. It was the one luxury he had not been able to afford, the fatal, blinding flaw that brought a desperate man through a solid wall of yew to strangle him. And she thought of deep loyalty. Thomas Jarvis had completely trusted his young son with a vital secret, keeping it perfectly safe for decades. It had been a gift, a piece of quiet magic shared between father and son. But it had tragically turned out to be both a gift and a terrible, devastating weapon, depending entirely on what kind of man the son became when faced with an intolerable, mocking injustice. A heavy secret built directly into the landscape, kept perfectly safe for 30 long years, and in the very end, it only took one single person knowing exactly where to press. I'm Jack, this is Midnight Pages from Ohio, and I'll be back next time with another story from the quiet side of the shelf. Leave a comment and tell me, at what point did you guess the secret of the garden? I'd love to know. Good night.